Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. My name is Elizabeth Draper, and I'm Deputy Chair of the English Association, and I'm very pleased to be hosting and chairing this session. The EA is a learned society and subject association which was founded in 1906 to promote, support, and celebrate the discipline of English studies. We cover all stages of education, from primary and early years through to secondary and further education, to higher education, and beyond. We also cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers. So thank you to tonight's speakers, Dr. Michael Smith and Dr. Mark Hyde. Our members make it possible to keep these events free and open to all by paying their membership fees. If you would like to contribute to the national conversation about English and help support our discipline, please consider joining us. It costs around £1 a week to support our events and campaigning work for a whole year. And you'll get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all our journals. Now it's my pleasure to hand over to tonight's speakers for our discussion, Thinking Forwards, Collaboration, Innovations in Assessment in FE English, exploring two interrelated studies focused on improving engagement and learning in GCSE within FE settings. So I'm going to first of all hand over to Michael.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Good evening, everybody. Hope you can hear me okay and see me okay. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. It's about 31 degrees in Barking and Dagenham, so a bit warmer than Manchester. And I know we've got some people from Spain and Chile. They might well have us beat on the temperature front. So yes, can you just confirm you can see my slides okay? Mark, Elizabeth, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, can see them, Michael.
Can see them completely fine.
Thank you so much. So, yes, good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Elizabeth mentioned, my name is Michael, Dr. Michael Smith, and I work at Barking and Dagenham College. I've been here for 12 years. I initially joined as an English teacher, and it was that kind of thread of teaching English, thinking about English, that led me to this research that I conducted. Part of my PhD work that was published a few years ago now, and it's really great to be here today to be sharing some of this work. I hope it resounds with you and your practice in whatever you do, in whatever discipline, and yeah, I hope you find it useful. Just to mention, I'll present for about 15 minutes or thereabouts, and then I will answer any questions and take comments and whatnot. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave before Mark shares his work because I have a governor's meeting I need to attend to this evening as well. But yeah, I know Mark's work is fantastic. I've worked, with Mark for a number of years, and yeah, I'm sure you'll enjoy that a great deal. Anyway, just to kind of jump straight in as to what we're looking at here. So I promise you, this is going to be looking at English assessment practice, but we're not going to start with English. We're going to start with this question. This is a bit participatory for all of us on a Monday afternoon. So what I'd like you to do is, on a scale of 1 to 10, decide how lifelike you think this drawing of the elephant here is, on a scale of 1 to 10. So go with your gut. You don't need to overthink it too much. You might want to write it down. You could just keep it in your head. So hopefully you've had an opportunity to give it a score there. Okay, another image of an elephant, a different image here. Same question though, on a scale of 1 to 10, how lifelike would you score this drawing of an elephant? Again, you might want to write that down. No need, if you'd rather not. Hopefully you have an opportunity to score that there. Okay, so 2 more elephants now. These are different from the first 2 elephants. I'd like you to decide from these elephants here, which one you feel is the more lifelike of the 2 here on the screen. So hopefully you've had opportunity to decide there.
People are putting in the chat, and the dominant answer is, I would say, right.
Okay, interesting. I would say right as well, interestingly. I mean, this is subjective. I think we can appreciate that. There's no exact science. Now, I promise you there is relevance here. I've intentionally chosen elephants rather than something English related because why not? It's a warm day. We can all imagine it's probably a great deal hotter in the savannah than here. So it could be worse. So what we've seen are two assessment scenarios. Scenario A, this is what I'd call a traditional summative assessment mode or scenario. And what we're asked to do, what I've asked you to today, is apportion a score, quantify quality, give some degree of measure as to what quality looks like. In this instance, it was on a scale of 1 to 10. And I'm guessing that the majority of us have gone with a higher score for the elephant on the right than on the left, but it is subjective. And the thing with this mode of assessment, although it's pretty well established, it is the traditional method, is that it is inherently subjective. And that when we're asked to do this, we're drawing on our own kind of impressions, and it's very hard to reconcile them. And research shows that. I'll talk to this in a bit more detail in a minute. But you know, the idea that one person's 4 is another person 6, and it might be that that's even the case in these decisions that we've made today in a very quick turnaround. Now, consider for a second then the assessment scenario that played out with scenario B. The two elephants alongside one another. Now, for one, I've intentionally chosen elephants that are a great deal more alike, and I think lifelike. They're probably better drawings, we might say. But crucially here, there's no score. I've not asked you to try and quantify what quality looks like. Rather, what we've done is we've used something called comparative judgment to make that comparison, one against the other. And in this essence, quality is being considered in context. What does quality mean when held against another item? That's what we've done. Now, the research that I've undertaken that I'm going to talk to you today is about this method of assessment, comparative judgment, because in my practice as an FE teacher and leader in English, I had real issues and concerns arising around how we were using this kind of traditional summative assessment method. Now, without going into great detail, what we were facing, the kind of problem sitting at the heart of this research was what I was finding with my colleagues and as a leader in the college in which I work, is that it was really tricky to get teachers to standardize and reconcile their marking across the team. Now, part of that was born of time constraints. In FE, we have a number of GCSE students that we're responsible for, maybe 100, maybe more, so probably more than secondary school contexts. And because of that, teachers were invariably stretched in teaching a great deal of students, but also challenged in trying to then apply their understanding of what good looks like, what standards mean when marking, because marking was a huge burden on their time. Some teachers had upwards of 120 scripts to mark. That meant that naturally time was impinged upon and quality dropped. So I had a real issue, and I wanted to explore, well, is there a different way? Now, sitting alongside this, and this is where we kind of move to the specifics of the research, is thinking about, well, what does good look like in a subject discipline? Well, we have the assessment standards, don't we, of course, but there are still issues, I think, even though we might have criteria and assessment standards and whatnot. Now, this research looks specifically at creative writing, which is an element of the GCSE English, like it is in many English syllabuses across the world. So there's really interesting research undertaken by Bell and Cowie, as well as others. But in this instance, they spoke about, in this research, how teachers would very often get impressions and have gut feelings about what a good piece of work, in this case, creative writing, might look like. And that it was often very difficult to describe what those gut feelings were, those impressions. And they often defied written outcomes and standards. So what about standards? We've got some here. And you can see at the bottom, I've adapted this from the GCSE English criteria, the assessment criteria. But I would say that the things that we're seeing here, they're pretty common across all assessment standards, regardless of the subject, of the level, of the discipline. So just to zoom in on a few here, as English teachers, we're asked to interpret these and then apply them fairly to make just and reasonable assessment decisions that's suitably evidenced alongside the work that we're marking. And what are we doing here? Well, with content, we're considering if students have used some, or made in this case, some sustained attempt to match the tone, the style and register to purpose and audience. We're asked to consider if there's a conscious use of vocabulary, some use of structural features, some not many, but more than a few, okay? And then an increasing variety of linked and relevant ideas. So my argument really, and what drew me into this research, was the inherent ambiguity and lack of any kind of quantifiable substance within this. Now, it's not my wish to quantify this, far from it. I think this speaks to the issues and the challenges that we often have as English teachers, trying to match this with what we know to be good quality work, and then the piece of work itself. So that when we're asked, can you mark this piece out of 24, and we're landing somewhere in this ballpark, that is a really difficult thing. And in truth, it's difficult in part because the standards themselves are making it a technical exercise. We've been asked to practice in a technical way. A bit more on that as we move through. So let's just think of our elephants again. Scenario A, we're asked to score them out of 10. Scenario B, compare which one is better. That's the only question we're asking. And comparative judgment, that is that mode of assessment, was something that I came across and I saw as being, an opportunity to see what this might mean in an FE context for GCSE English. That hadn't been done up to the point of this research. Now, No More Marking are an organisation that some of you might be familiar with, and they have done a great deal of research in this space. They've in fact created software, a screenshot of which I'll show you in a moment, that allows you as a teacher to upload student work and then comparatively judge, considering each time which is the better of the two scripts. So why use comparative judgment? Well, research had indicated that it took less time. Teachers could mark quicker than they were before. I mean, that's attractive to all of us. It also showed that there was a greater reliability, that there was less difference between the teacher judgments that were being made than as with traditional assessment modes. And lastly, there's a validity, because we're asking teachers to consider, well, which item of work is the best between the two. You make that decision. You don't necessarily need assessment standards. What you can be doing is drawing on your gut feelings. And that was really at the heart of what I wanted to understand more of in this research. Now, while I've mentioned here research has indicated all this, what research hasn't done is at the time tackle this in a GCSE English context. So I really wanted to know whether this was applicable, and also what it might mean for FE teachers. So this is a screenshot of No More Marking and their software that they provide for comparative judgment. You upload all your scripts. We've got 2 examples here, and we're just going to make a decision which is the better response. So we're going to read them both as we would normally when marking. When we're ready to make a decision, we either click left or we click right. Now, when uploading a sample of scripts, let's say we've uploaded 15, it's going to offer different scripts in different configurations. And you might end up doing 50, 60 of these, but in time, it's going to sort best to worst based on the decisions that you've been making. So that's the kind of principle behind comparative judgment. And as I say, research had indicated that it was quicker than traditional methods. So how I actually went about doing this, I worked with a small group of teachers, 5 in this case. We had a workshop in which we all undertook comparative judgment. There were 15 scripts that were uploaded, and the goal was to mark or assess 70 in an hour, so 70 judgments. As I say, facilitated by the comparative judgment platform offered by No More Marking. Teachers were just asked, choose the best text of the 2. I then followed this up with interviews, and this was really the crucial part for me. I was interested in what the comparative judgment exercise would show in terms of reliability. Would we agree? Would it save time? but I also really wanted to get at the heart of what teachers were drawing on when they were doing this exercise. I'm taking assessment standards away and saying, you decide what's better. So what did the research find? Really, really interesting things. I mean, overwhelmingly, teachers largely agreed on what good quality creative writing looked like. I say overwhelmingly, from the 5, there were 4 largely. The 4 teachers pretty much agreed almost as an overlay from one another's assessment decisions. The 5th teacher, interestingly, was doing teacher training, and they had less experience in teaching and assessing the subject. They were something of an outlier, but they were still pretty reliable. And through the software, they use a number of measures. This in-fit score, the reliability score, was deemed high. Now, fascinatingly for me were how the teachers responded to marking, or rather assessing, in this way. And teachers were talking about these intangible qualities that creative writing often holds. So they were talking about how the writing flowed, how they enjoyed the content, and even enjoyed as readers, engaging with it, reading it. There was also this really interesting dimension where they were engaging from an aesthetic point of view as readers, as we might read anything and be moved by a text or affected by a text. They were asking, well, the thing that I valued was, did it grip me when I was reading it, or did I feel pulled in? So you'll know, English teachers, all of us on the call, the figurative language there, did it grip me? We're personifying the students writing it, feeling pulled in. So there's this really interesting dimension where teachers' gut impressions and feelings about the work were thinking of the text as a genuine piece of writing, and not the act of assessment as a technical exercise. So what does this mean for practice? Crucially here, guild knowledge. Guild knowledge is this idea by Royce Sadler, who talks about how teachers over a period of time will develop and accumulate this pooled knowledge, drawing on the guild of medieval times, how knowledge was passed down generation to generation, master to apprentice. And what he's arguing, and I think what this research perhaps indicates, is that teachers have this guild knowledge, that it's something that is learned and developed over time, and it's developed and it evolves over time through collaboration with others. The fact that the trainee teacher had a lower reliability score is not a surprise, but it's actually getting to the heart of, well, why is that? And it's because perhaps that teacher wasn't yet in the tradition of assessing and teaching English the same level as their peers. And underneath this, I think crucially, there is value in providing opportunities for dialogue in which the community, in this case, English teachers, English assessors, can evolve and develop the practice of what it means to represent, understand a good piece of writing. So the teachers all managed to assess without needing assessment standards. And that's because I think they're in this dialogue and in this guild. So it's for us to make opportunity for that. And I think not just with teachers, but students as well. Part of this work did look at that too. So yes. So if you're interested in learning a bit more about it, feel free to email me if you'd like to have a read of the full thesis. There is a shortened version in which I talk on the work that I did with students as well as part of this research. And that's actually been published through English in Education earlier this year, looking at this idea of what a good one looks like. And the last thing to mention, this was completed a couple of years ago now, this research. And one of the most exciting, I think, new develops that both Mark and I are involved in is how we are exploring the use of AI in the context of assessment practice for GCSE English as well as maths. And what's really gratifying for me is that we've managed to create a platform and a way in which students can receive and act upon feedback that's been developed through AI. And it's been made possible through this research, as well as some of the research Mark will go on to talk about. Now, we're really cautious about AI. I think there's, we're in kind of evangelizing territory. There's a lot of people overstating and overselling what it can do. But we're really excited for our part in how we're using it, I think in an ethical and learner and teacher-centered way. So if you are interested, feel free to reach out. You've got my email address here or the contact here. And yeah, just huge thanks. I think the slides will be sent out later. So yeah, huge thanks for your time and listening. And are there any questions or comments?
There's one comment in the chat that says, were those who took part familiar with the existing mark scheme?
Yes, so everyone had assessed for at least one round of mock exams before undertaking this. So they had sight of them and used them in an assessment context, yes. So it could arguably be that they were drawing on that as a form of their guild knowledge, I suppose, as well as other markers of quality. Yes.
Okay, and someone has commented to say they use this no more marking, is it in their old school, and it helped massively with moderation and the workload. I was just going to ask you, is there a cost to no more marking? Do you have to pay for it?
Yes, there is a cost, I think. I mean, I used the free version somewhat cheekily. I did email to ask permission and all, but yeah, they used to at least make a trial version available. And I would encourage people to explore that. But I know that they run big school pilots and there is a cost involved.
And are you suggesting, Michael, that with the new project that you're working on with AI, would that be sort of duplicating, replicating, building on the no more marking?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what we're not using is comparative judgment. We're using marked scoring because that's what that's the traditional. But the power of this is that you can through AI train a model and have a reference point of say 100 mark scripts, and that in itself will hone its assembly AI model in a practice similar to what was done through this research. To make sure that the assessment is just and fair. So similar but slightly different. I think we appreciate the value of giving students scores out of a total because there's like an innate kind of psychological thing to that, isn't there? Receiving a score, and of course that's what they're working towards at the end of the year as well.
Yeah. I mean, it would be brilliant to have you back on at a later point to actually talk about how you're using AI for assessment, because that, I'm sure, is a real hot potato right up and down the country in terms of FE English and of course all subjects. So that would be really interesting to hear about that. But what is really fascinating about your presentation as well is the way you're giving a platform and space to talk about assessment and standardization and dialogue and the importance of teachers being able to talk to each other about marking and standardizing, and that those conversations are critical throughout the year. And I know that with time pressures, sometimes they can be marginalized, and actually they're the heart of everything, aren't they?
Yes, exactly. I could not have said it better, Elizabeth. I mean, the problem that I started with was that we weren't doing that, which means the very spirit of what English is and bringing that alive into the classroom when we teach wasn't as kind of the fire wasn't stoked enough. It is absolutely critical.
Yes. Somebody's just written, I know you've got to go in just a minute, but just there is a comment by Nikki Smith, Michael. I don't know if you can read it. Can you read it?
Yeah, great comment,
Would you like
Nikki.
to respond? Would you like to read it out?
Yeah, so no, it's okay. I've got it here. So yes, it's such a good point that we will have our own innate, understanding and feeling as to what good creative writing is, and there is a standard at which students are required to write at grade 4 standard or grade 9 or whatever, and it's how we reconcile that our own internal markers with what the standard is. My kind of reservation, my challenge to the standards is that they're too ambiguous and they have to be brought alive by discussion. So there's a great deal of reliance on the teachers doing that work. Interestingly, Royce Sadler, in introducing the idea of guild knowledge, talks about, crucially, the need to download that to students. That was the whole kind of underpinning thing that he was talking about. So it's really interesting that you've mentioned students there in that last point.
And I think Bianca's written a comment, which I seem to have lost. Can you see Bianca's comment just before?
Yeah, absolutely. So marks can be a really powerful and potent thing. They can also be debilitating because students can focus on the number and not so much the quality of what it is they need to improve in. And I agree. I mean, the beauty of comparative judgment, and as I say, I did this with students as well as teachers, as is outlined in that journal article, is that students, when they're confronted with that, it's a challenge at first, but then they can get around it. And yes.
Yes, and Phil has said GCSE is about good language use, not always about good and gripping storytelling. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what we're often trying to do in our classrooms is bring alive the world of English, and then remember at the end of it, there is a gatepost we need to jump over and clear. But sometimes you can sustain and foster the love of something that's then going to help the latter.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the hope. Okay, Michael, I know you've got to go to this meeting that's starting in about 2 minutes. So thank you so very much, Dr. Michael Smith, for that. Lots of food for thought there. And I encourage anyone who's interested to email Michael, and I'm sure he'll get back. And watch this space, because I'm sure we'll get Michael and Mark back at a later point. Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks,
so much.
Michael. Take care. Bye. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Hyde. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much. And afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And thanks for having me. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see that now. Okay, so my name's Mark Hyde, and the name of my study is Dynamic and Personal Prisms in the Acquisition and Development of English, reimagining the pedagogy of language in aesthetic experience. So this study explores the lived experiences of learners studying on the English Language GCSE RECIT programme in FE, whilst also identifying some prejudices that exist in some more prescriptive language curricula, and analysing the impact that this kind of elitist ideology around language might have on some of our learners. Whilst also looking at how we can use aesthetic experience as a pedagogic intervention to analyse how these same learners respond when the mode of language that they study more closely reflects their experience of and their social cultural lives and their experience of life. For a little bit of background, my background is actually plumbing. I was a plumber. I worked in the plumbing industry for some time, and I actually came into education to teach plumbing. And I've taught English for about 4 or 5 years now. But first alongside the plumbing, and now I solely teach English. But the reason I'm telling you this is because my research study started a long time ago, before COVID, although at the time I had no idea it was going to grow into a sort of research study. But it started with a plumbing group I had that were a pretty typical group in that they were very keen. They were very diligent learners. They were intrinsically motivated. They would hand their work in on time. They would be of a good standard. But when they went to English, well, we first of all would be lucky if they went to English at all. But when they did go to English, they didn't engage. They exhibited some challenging behaviours. They disrupted the learning process. And I was getting endless emails from my colleague in the English department saying, we really need to talk about these learners. And I couldn't believe that he was talking about the same learners who in their plumbing studies were completely different. So what followed was a quite long, actually, quite lengthy and open and candid conversation with these plumbing learners, where I said, what's wrong? Why are you not going to English? Where's the block? And to cut a really long conversation down into a very quick summary, essentially these learners told me that they constantly felt that it was implied that their language or the way they use language was not good enough. And then by extension, they felt that they weren't good enough, and that these learners felt diminished and excluded in English language learning, but also in assessment, in the way that they've been assessed through English language GCSEs. Now, once I started talking to these learners and I started to hear about these prejudices that exist and the way they feel about studying language and their narrative accounts of their experiences, I started seeing this prejudice around language more and more in society. And these are some tweets from the 2021 Tokyo Olympic Games that Alex Scott, ex-professional footballer Alex Scott, was on the presentation team for the BBC, and Lord Digby Jones took to Twitter to say, as you can see here, "Enough, I can't stand it anymore. Alex Scott spoils a good presentational job on the BBC Olympics team with a very noticeable inability to pronounce her G's." And then he goes on with another tweet that's asking, "Can't somebody give these people elocution lessons?" We may just sort of write this off as a sort of, isolated incident of snobbery. But what's even more worrying and harder to ignore is I've started to see more and more of these examples of where this prejudice around language exists in education more widely. A striking example of that is when All Saints School, which is a school in London, implemented a slang ban on learners. The reason behind this ban on their learners' idiomatic voice was that they wanted their learners to be able to express themselves in more proper ways, and it was a policy which TES magazine said could cause learners long-term damage, making them feel stigmatized and discriminated against. What's important to mention, though, is that this is nothing new. So these sort of ideologies around how arts should be used or how language should be used have existed for a long, long time. And throughout history, we can see many examples here of where people have gone against the grain. And what you're seeing on the screen now are people that have gone against the grain and gone against the conventions or the traditions of their arts to express themselves in slightly different ways and express themselves in ways that maybe more accurately reflect who they are or their life experience or how they see the world. And on the left, you've got punk musicians, Iggy Pop and Polystyrene, who were largely marginalized and ignored for the peak moments of their careers. Iggy Pop was even famously called in Rolling Stone magazine subliterate, even though I think he's a fantastic songwriter. That's just my opinion. Claude Monet was also barred from most of the art salons in Paris because he painted his style of painting was executed in more of an impressionist style rather than like a photograph like painting. And Jack Kerouac again what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, he forewent some of the more sort of structural features of language and the mechanics of language grammatically in favor of getting a story down in the moment and trying to capture the energy and the feeling of that story in the moment. Now, of course, we could go on and look at these examples of where, throughout history, tradition rejects change until change eventually becomes the new tradition. Now, here's some words that were used to describe some of these artists and musicians, words such as they have a poverty of feeling and they are tasteless and they have a hostility to intelligence. But what I've sneakily done here is I've mixed in a few words from my learner participants in this study when I asked them to describe how they feel about their experiences of studying language in as few a word as possible. And they told me words like they felt isolated, pointless, intimidated, frustrated, irrelevant, fatigued, even discriminated against. And what Joseph Dunn tells us is that for any practice to survive, it has to be constantly reinvented and reimagined by its insiders, i.e. its genuine practitioners, even in ways that may seem subversive. And what my study suggests is that it's time that we reinvent the way we approach language acquisition and development and assessment, particularly in further education. So I touched on Joseph Dunn there. That brings me to the sort of foundation of this study, which is my literature review. I won't talk about this too much, but I want to in particular point out the book in the top left, which is by Basil Bernstein, and in particular Bernstein's idea of pedagogic rights. Bernstein offers this pedagogic framework of pedagogic rights in all activities we carry out in education. Learners should feel enhanced, included, and they should be able to actively participate in their education. So what I've tried to do in this study is create an educational environment in which those pedagogic rights are paramount and they're embedded and they're enacted for learners at every point. So I've tried to take Bernstein's framework and put it into practice essentially and bring these pedagogic rights to life to see how learners respond. Alongside that, other key concepts that have influenced my study are John Dewey's concept of height and vitality, Gadamer's concept of a fusion of horizons, and Paulo Freire's from these pedagogy of oppressed, where his assertion that education should be an emancipatory experience as opposed to an experience that diminishes learners. On the methodologies, I won't go through this too quickly. I'll put a handy little image there just to make this a lot easier. But really, really quickly, in terms of my response to the ontological, epistemological, and methodological questions, I lean to the right of this continuum in that my research paradigm is one of a constructivist, interpretivist, and inductive nature. And the reason for that is that what I'm trying to do. Well, tried to do in this study was build narrative accounts of learners' lived experiences of studying language. So I wanted to get their stories so I could build pictures of what these learners, of the experiences that these learners have had. Therefore, my methods were very much around focus groups, semi-structured interviews. I carried out an illustrative case study with one learner, and language activities that utilize semi-structured, socially situated literacies. So in terms of data collection and analysis, I approached it from a reflexive thematic analysis point of view and model. The purpose of this model, as it says there, is to ensure that the process of data analysis are as systematic, transparent, credible, authentic, and as trustworthy as possible. The reflexivity part is all about me remaining aware, really, of my positionality within the research. And through reflexivity, my own interpretations do not distort the data analysis process, but actually maintain an open environment in which unexpected outcomes are embraced. To help me do this, I included some multiple coders throughout the data analysis process. So I had 2 other people look at the research transcripts. They didn't know about my study. I just asked them to point out what was interesting, and we coded the data and created themes that way. Now, findings, I had a lot of findings from my research and way too many to try and get through, and I'm aware that time's ticking, so I'm going to get through this quickly, but I just wanted to share one finding just to give a bit of a flavour. This is finding 1 from theme 4, which ended up being called Energy and Heightened Vitality. The finding is that aesthetic experience as a pedagogic intervention can unlock learners' imagination and lead to a sense of heightened vitality in the classroom. And there's a lengthy learner comment there, which I won't run through. But this is from a learner participant called David, which is a pseudonym. And David is showing here a sense of heightened vitality in the learning process. And I pick on David in particular because all the learner participants in my study went on a bit of a journey and found new and interesting ways to engage with language. But David's in particular was a little bit rocky. When we were in the latter stages of the data collection process, and I'd become quite confident that my learners were going to bring some interesting language to our focus groups from their own worlds, maybe whether it be music or wherever they've found this language, and we were going to discuss the language, talk about why it's interesting, talk about how it relates to their life, find the interesting components in the language and discuss them. And on this one occasion, David brought in some language that he'd first found on YouTube and he'd been engaging with, and it was from a right-wing commentator called Douglas Murray. And some of the views that David had been engaging with were questionable and even potentially offensive. So I, as an educator, as any educator would do in that situation, I intervened and I encouraged David to look on the other side of the argument, and I suggested some further reading, which I shared with him, which to his credit he did. But then another learner in the same focus group shared some language he'd been engaging with, and he'd actually brought in some song lyrics from the musician John Lennon, which were very much around anti-war sort of themes. And as this learner was talking about this language, and he was telling me what it means to him, and he was relating it to some of the, to some of the world events that were happening at the time, he cleverly and subtly moved his trail of thought onto David's previous comments, and this other learner just started discussing his ideas with David and challenging David's earlier thoughts. And then for my part in this conversation, I took a bit of a back seat and I just listened, and I watched as David very thoughtfully listened and carefully listened to Timothy. And David had the courage and the foresight to change his mind and the maturity to change his mind. And what I could see in action was these 2 learners growing and learning together. And actually, I think what it was democracy in action. When we come towards the end of my study, I asked all learner participants to sum up their experiences of being part of my research study through an aesthetic experience. And David picked this album cover of, as we'll all, I'm sure, be familiar with, Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. And the reason David picked this was because he said before this research study, he saw language as just a grey linear line, a means to an end, a method of communication, nothing more. And now he sees language as this myriad of opportunities and possibilities, ways in which he can navigate his world and better understand himself and better understand his future. So there was a bit of a finding that I wanted to share with you. It's a really, really brief one. I ended up with 4 recommendations from the findings I found. The first recommendation I have is that we should use aesthetic experience in language acquisition and development activities. We should move away from pen and paper exams towards more expressive forms of assessment. We should elevate the learner voice in creating democratic and open learning environments. And finally, we should place a greater emphasis on arts-based learning in language education, which is similar to my first recommendation, but this one is more around curriculum designers and policy makers, encouraging them to see language as more of an artistic subject than it currently seems to be thought of. And I'm aware that I raced through that really quickly, but I was conscious of time. And so thank you so much for listening. And I'm sorry that I raced through it so quickly.
Mark,
Thank you.
that was absolutely fascinating and really rich with ideas and thinking. Bianca has put a response, if you want to read it, in the chat.
Thank you.
And if anyone else has got any points that they want to say, any comments about Michael's really interesting work, please let us know in the chat. Have you got it, Mark?
I have, yes. Thank you so much, Bianca. Yeah, it's I think I think I couldn't have said it better myself. It's that meaning making, and we all do that in different ways. And I think one of the ways we're going wrong in language education is that we decide how learners should engage with language, but they have these rich cultural influences on their language and the way they speak and the way they express themselves that are so valuable, and yet it's not that we tell them that they're not allowed, but we just don't allow enough scope for them to bring that in. I think John Dewey said something about how we have to make learning with inside college intrinsic to learning outside of college as well. So learners are not coming into college and sort of parking their real life at the door, doing their education and then picking their real life up again on the way out. And so, yeah, I totally agree with that. And it's perfectly put, Bianca. Thanks for the comment.
Yeah, critical literacy, really important. Somebody said, could you reshare the 4 recommendations at the end, Mark? Could you just put that screen up again?
Yeah, absolutely, I can. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'll reshare those 4 recommendations. Again, apologies for the speed. I was looking at the clock and I was running out of time. So yeah, the first recommendation is that we should use aesthetic experience, whether that be song, film, song lyrics, image, to create that emotional connection to the language, to the lesson content. And this study really shows that that's really effective in language acquisition and development activities. Moving away from the sort of traditional pen and paper exams towards some more expressive forms of assessment, elevating the learner voice in creating democratic and open learning environments, and placing a greater emphasis on arts-based learning in language education.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, so clearly you incorporate this in your own teaching, Mark.
I do, and as much as I can, I encourage the learners to bring in their own language, and I feel most comfortable in the classroom. And I think that's because my learners feel most comfortable in the classroom when they're expressing themselves through their own literacies and through language that means something to them. The problem is that if I do that too much, I feel that I'm not properly preparing learners for the assessment, the GCSE exam. So it's important I have to go back to sort of typical GCSE style text, but I really see the learners come alive, and that Dewey sense of height and vitality when they're able to discuss their own language in their own ways.
Certainly using song lyrics, which I've done quite a lot, is a really good way in, isn't it?
Yeah.
Someone said, has mentioned, Phil is gone, the message has gone, about Shakespeare using the language of the street.
Yes.
Kind of ironic that young people find it really hard to navigate, and yet, maybe it's about the way we teach it. Well, I think it probably is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right
Yeah. Absolutely.
And also someone saying, I think it's Vicky Kingham saying, a really interesting study, and we're trying to move away from the static and uniform way of teaching language for GCSE. Absolutely, you're showing that, we do have this curriculum content to go through, but I mean, what you're demonstrating vividly is we can be dynamic with it, and we can bring students with us and bring their own rich language and experience into teaching.
Yeah.
So, sorry, Mark.
Oh no, I'm sorry. If we're out of time, no worries. But I saw just a comment from Nikki, a question from Nikki Smith said, "What was the most interesting text learners have brought in?" Should I answer it? I know we're at 5:30.
Answer it, Mark.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, because there was a lot. It's really hard to pick because there was a lot of really, really interesting text. But one that really stayed in my mind was a learner participant brought in some lyrics from a rapper, who I'd never heard of, to my shame. I'd never heard of him. His name's Lil Baby. but the content of the music was about police brutality. And when my learner brought this in, I became really worried that he'd experienced some sort of police brutality. But when we went on to discuss the language, he hadn't experienced any police brutality, thankfully. But what he did was he likened, even not that this is any better, but he likened some of his experiences of studying language in school to some of the lyrics of the way this rapper Lil Baby felt about the way that he's been treated by police in terms of being forced to do things they don't want to do. And the way that this learner was able to see his own experience in the lyrics, even though he was looking at it from a completely different perspective, was just mind-blowing. And the way he spoke about the lyrics was so eloquent. And this learner was someone who's traditionally was a little bit more, typically was a little bit more reserved, and he didn't bring himself into the learning process too easily. But on this particular session, he just came to life, and he spoke so beautifully, and he wrote about the lyrics so beautifully as well.
That's brilliant. And Alberto Lazaro has saying that he recommends the 1974 poem Them and Us by Tony Harrison when he talks about society's judgments about accents and so on.
Fantastic.
And also the work of Ian Cushing, which I'm sure you've come across. I mean, Ian Cushing and April Baker Bell as well. I mean, there are many others, you know, interesting contributions. Thank you very much. We definitely do need, as somebody saying, a part two to this presentation because there's so many ideas and such expertise to share. So thank you very much, Mark.
Thanks for having me
along and doing this talk with us. So it leaves me to thank all Michael as well, Dr. Michael Smith, and can I recommend that also people go onto the English Association website to see forthcoming events in the months ahead. We do these very regularly, more or less on a weekly basis. And so I'm going to stop recording now. So thank you very much. Let me just work out how to do this. Just find the button. Recording.